The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2019 World Affairs Forum, Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World. In this lecture, Whipped into a Frenzy, Anti-Media Violence in American History and the Perilous Course Ahead, Dr. David Noon of the University of Alaska Southeast describes how understanding the historical relationship between presidents, violence, and popular culture helps us make sense of our current media environment.
Thank you. I'm on sabbatical this year, which means I don't usually have to dress up. I just have like a pile of hoodies on the floor, and every day I wake up and select one and stare into the void. It also means that I don't converse with adults all that often, so this is a little bit of a novel experience for me. But in any case, thanks for coming out on a sunny Friday afternoon. This is about 50 more people than I expected to see, so good for all of us. What I'm going to talk about today is kind of linked up with the project that I've been working on over the last several years, but more recently as part of my sabbatical. I'm looking at representations of presidents doing violent things in popular culture going all the way back to the 19th century. So this is sort of a part of a draft of a final chapter on the current occupant of the White House. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the question of violence for individuals and institutions in the American media has been an increasingly conspicuous problem. Start with my slides here. Most folks, I'm sure, remember last June when Jared Ramos shot his way into a newsroom in Annapolis, Maryland, and killed 5 reporters, staffers, and editors at the Capital Gazette. In October of 2018, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered at the Saudi consulate in Turkey. He was a Saudi dissident who was at the time writing for the Washington Post. And he was murdered almost certainly with the direct involvement with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. That same month, a Floridian named Cesar Sayoc mailed 16 pipe bombs to a spectrum of political, entertainment, and journalistic figures, including a pair of explosives that were mailed to the CNN headquarters in New York. When Sayoc was arrested, it was discovered that he had a list of nearly 100 targets altogether, including more journalists. The list of targets, along with Sayoc himself, were headquartered in this van that you see here, which was infamously festooned with a variety of stickers expressing contempt for CNN. You see down there at the bottom left corner, CNN sucks, endorsing a variety of conspiracy theories, most of them linked to the far right, and celebrating in various ways President Donald Trump, including there's a top soccer youth recruits, or top youth soccer recruits for Trump. We're not really sure what that organization is, but in any case, although Sarah Sanders would very quickly insist when asked by journalists about the link between Sayoc and her boss, she insisted that journalists were acting in bad faith and poor taste when asking those kinds of questions. But journalists have been asking those kinds of questions for a while and predicting precisely what Sayoc attempted to carry out. Now, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time cataloging Donald Trump's rhetorical hostility toward ordinary journalism. At this point, it's an essential part of his political persona, his public persona, and contempt for journalism and reporters and the mainstream media is pretty much encoded into the political DNA of his most committed backers. On Trump's first day in office, he described journalists as being, quote, among the most dishonest human beings on earth. He's described specific news organizations as pathetic, dishonest, failing, and in one case, a pile of garbage. As of March 27th, just the other day when I stopped tracking this, Trump had tweeted 415 times about fake news. 18 times this month alone. He had tweeted 25 times about journalists being, quote, the enemy of the people. And he's used both of those phrases countless times in public appearances around the country. He has retweeted videos and images depicting violence against the media. This is a collage of Trump's tweets here. You see down here in the bottom left corner, the kind of convergence rather of Trumpian rhetoric, fake news media and enemy of the people in the same tweet. But in addition to tweeting his own thoughts on the media, he's also retweeted images of violence, depicting violence against the media. Here you've got a doctored video in which the actual Donald Trump back in sometime in the 2000s, he appeared as a wrestler. That was with Vince McMahon. His wife just apparently resigned from the Trump cabinet today. But in any case, you got this doctored wrestler video in which Trump body slammed someone with a CNN logo in place of a head. He also retweeted and then deleted that tweet that you see here of a train hitting a CNN logo. This was 3 days after the events in Charlottesville in which Heather Heyer was run down in a car. So the poor timing, poorer timing than usual, encouraged the deletion. Trump's son, Donald Jr., whom you see here before his divorce beard was grown, similarly retweeted a video of his father running over CNN's Jim Acosta with a golf cart. And I should note, just a sort of weird kind of brush with fame, Jim Acosta and I went to college together at James Madison. He was sort of in the concentric rings of my social world. He was like in the second or third ring. We actually did a public affairs talk show on the radio station that nobody ever listened to back in like 1991, 1992. And now he makes $1 million for CNN, and I do this. So in any case, distrust of the media, which I think this is obviously a subset of this. There is, of course, a lot of conversation about distrust of the media, but Trump has, certainly been a big advocate for a kind of aggressive skepticism. Over the past 3 years, Trump and the people in his orbit have actively encouraged, or at least refused to discourage, harassment of journalists, particularly at rallies where supporters have often verbally and physically intimidated reporters, chanted obscenities. The sticker that you saw on Sayak's van, CNN sucks. This is a ritual. This is a choreographed part of Trump's rallies now. It's alongside of the other kind of moments that you expect in a Trump rally, like lock her up chants and stuff like that. CNN sucks is pretty much an everyday occurrence. So you have those kinds of things, but you also have numerous instances in which reporters have been assaulted. At a rally in El Paso in February, Trump was going through his usual litany of complaints about the dishonest media. During these moments in his rallies, he will always point to the media well at the back, and so the audience will often turn and directly address reporters with their chants and various epithets. And at this particular rally, Eleanor Montague, who is a BBC editor, she described the crowd being whipped into a frenzy. And when one of the supporters at the rally actually attacked a BBC photographer in the middle of Trump's speech, the crowd responded by "let him go," with the chant of "let him go." So these are the kinds of things that of course, if you pay attention to politics, none of this is particularly surprising. It's not news. But in any case, Trump has played along the margins of, endorsing these kinds of things. The sitcom Murphy Brown, the reboot, imagined several months back precisely the sort of thing that you see at the rally in February. The program imagined a reporter being body slammed, almost at Trump's command in that episode. Again, this is the sort of thing that the reality and the imagination of what might happen kind of converge. During Montana's special congressional election in 2017, you might recall the candidate for the Republican Party, Greg Gianforte, actually body slammed a reporter who had asked him a question about health care. Gianforte responded by throwing him to the ground and punching him and then lying about it until audio tape of the encounter surfaced, and he had to basically admit to what he had done. When Trump came to Montana a couple of times, actually, there was a rally in Billings and then another one later on in Missoula. Trump expressed something ranging from appreciation to gratitude to Gianforte for doing that. He described Gianforte as, quote, my kind of guy, and claimed in October of 2018, again, the same month that Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, and the same month that Cesar Sayoc mailed his first round of bombs, Trump claimed that real Montanans would be impressed with the candidate who body slammed a journalist. So this is, again, pretty routine stuff by this point. As I said a moment ago, distrust of the media has a long history. It predates Trump's ascent to office. Nixon, of course, for those who can remember Nixon, my first political memory is of my father explaining Watergate to me at the age of 4. This is when I became aware of such a thing as the presidency. This is my first political memory, learning about Tricky Dick, which until my father explained who Richard Nixon was, I thought Tricky Dick was a cartoon character that I hadn't heard of. But Nixon, of course, was famously contemptuous of the media. He kept a list of enemies. His speechwriter, William Safire, in his memoir Before the Fall, noted that Nixon was actually very instrumental and very deliberate in describing the institution of journalism as the media rather than the press. The latter term seemed to connote something more dignified, whereas the media suggested something more akin to advertising, which Americans were more likely to be skeptical of. And of course, as part of Nixon's whole collage of misdeeds that led to his resignation, there were conversations about carrying out acts of revenge against Nixon's enemies. Jack Anderson, the syndicated columnist, was one of the major targets. And there were actually discussions that took place in the White House, of course, recorded, in which they discussed possibilities for taking Anderson out, including poisoning him by smearing his steering wheel with LSD, which I thought was it's really thinking outside the box there. But in any case, public confidence in journalism, public confidence in a whole variety of institutions, education, religious institutions, the military, elected bodies, these have all fluctuated over time. So journalism is subject to a varying degrees of confidence publicly. By now, we've, for the last couple decades, been in a kind of environment where most Americans are skeptical for one reason or another of the veracity of the news media, of the press. Many of those numbers, public polling indicates that a certain percentage of Americans lack confidence or express some reservations about the accuracy the reporting. And there's a large partisan divide between those. More recently, this was a Knight Ridder poll that was conducted and given some coverage it was a Columbia Journalism Review poll, indicated that about 65% of self-identified Republicans expressed hardly any confidence at all in those running the nation's media. Fewer than 10% expressed a great deal of confidence in those same outlets. Gallup similarly has found wide discrepancies among Democrats and Republican respondents, at least self-identified, when it comes to media trust. Those gaps have widened considerably since 2016, with roughly 75% of self-identified Democrats, according to this one poll, and only 20% of self-identified Republicans sharing a view that journalists are generally accurate. So there's kind of definitely something to be sort of noted in that. As an historian, I think that it's important to reflect on periods in the nation's past that might serve as foils in some way for thinking about these kinds of issues. Partisan divisions over the news media are linked to a whole variety of other points of intense disagreement among Americans. So it's not simply a distrust in the media or skepticism toward the media or discrepant views that break down along party lines, specifically about the media. These reservations, these concerns about the media are linked to a whole variety of other kind of questions. No one who studies American history would be fooled for very long into thinking that there was not a point in the past where Americans weren't passionately arrayed against one another over one question, of a question of one kind or another. There are some eras, I think, that speak a little more immediately to us. And I want to reflect on one of those. Somebody I know recently commented that it always seems like the worst parts of the 19th century remain continually relevant. And I thought that was a really depressing but cogent observation. It's one that I can't disagree with as someone who spends a lot of time studying the 19th century. It does often feel like there's a lot of familiarity to it. So I want to spend some time kind of thinking about one particular era, and that's the 1830s, which of course contained the seeds for what 3 decades later would prove to be the bitterest of harvests. Okay, here's some more slides I forgot about. Here's Gianfort. And of course, disagreements over whether that should be disqualifying to beat up a reporter. Gianfort's election, I suppose, answers the question in the negative. But in any case, the development of the press in the late 18th and early 19th century was accompanied by all kinds of violence. The United States has a deeply partisan history to it. The United States has a deeply violent history, and those things collide all the time. In the late 18th and early 19th century, we see a lot of crowd actions taking place against newspapers and editors. This is a sporadic feature of American life. We have a long history of intensely personal disputes that take place between editors, between rival political figures, and so forth, powerful individuals within their communities. There's a wonderful book that I looked at a little bit called Our Press Gang, written by a 19th century a journalist in exile, a guy who wrote for a while and then abandoned the profession and then wrote this really long denunciation of his field in 1860, a guy named Lambert Wilmer, who wrote this long book that described what he called the bottomless abyss of typographical iniquity plaguing the print culture of the nation. And one chapter in this book is, and the whole book is just empurpled with denunciations of one person or another, or one newspaper or another. But he has an entire chapter devoted to duels that take place between editors, and these happen all the time. And not only did Wilmer describe duels between editors, But he also pointed out that the vast majority of duels that took place in general in American life had been sparked by insults, or what in the 19th century were often called personalities, lobbed in the pages of the press. So newspapers not only became the stage for violence between editors, but they also served as a vector for organized violence, ritualized violence in affairs of honor in the general public. So that's one pattern of press violence. The other is much more collective, driven by partisanship, but involving crowd actions taken on behalf of majoritarian interests, by mobs acting as regulators on behalf of the people, however the people are defined. These are crowd actions that are rooted in a sense of dismay, incensed that one idea or another might be printed, dangerous ideas infecting a particular community. So we see crowd actions taken during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, against newspaper editors who didn't toe a particular line. They weren't seen as sufficiently patriotic. Editors that during the Revolutionary struggle were tagged as loyalists. During the War of 1812, lots of newspapers edited by Federalists who generally opposed the war were sacked. So this happens quite frequently during wartime. During the 1830s, though, there's a particular stew of factors that produce one of the most violent decades outside of, say, the 1860s that the 19th century actually witnessed. And this is a combination of racism, sectionalism, and political partisanship that focuses on the circulation of printed material related to slavery. Newspapers, books, transcribed speeches, manifestos. There is an avalanche of printed material from the 1830s onward devoted to conversations about slavery. And if we're looking at abolitionist literature, this is printed material that jeopardizes white supremacy by openly critiquing one of its main institutions. Slavery's defenders were convinced that there's a link between this published material and acts of violence, like Nat Turner's rebellion in the fall of 1831 in Southampton, Virginia. They're convinced in particular that Nat Turner's revolt can be traced to a publication like this. This is David Walker's Appeal. David Walker was a free-born African-American from the South, which there were plenty of. What was unusual is that his mother was a free black woman. Most free blacks in the South were male. But in any case, David Walker fled the South, set up a tailoring business in Boston, Massachusetts, and in his free time, he wrote one of the most amazing pieces of abolitionist literature in the 19th century. Walker's Appeal circulated nationwide, and it inspired bounties being placed on his head. The state of Georgia offered, this is an official bounty passed by the legislature, offering $5,000 for Walker's corpse, but $10,000 if someone would bring him in alive. So he was more valuable as someone to be tortured and toyed with, someone to likely be executed publicly, than he was simply as a dead body. Other publications like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, one of the 2 or 3 most important abolitionist newspapers in the 19th century, were also identified as being provocative and in need of suppression. By the middle of the 1830s, the United States was experiencing a wave of civil unrest that for many observers seemed to threaten the stability of the Republic. In that year alone, 1835, there were roughly 150 riots that took place across the country. More than 2/3 of those occurred between July and October of that year. So the late summer, early fall of 1835 was a particularly violent period. Public disturbances occurred for any number of reasons, but a lot of these particular instances of social unrest were caused by reactions against abolitionists. Many of these confrontations were inspired and directed against the circulation of printed words flowing from abolitionist presses. It's no coincidence that 1835 was a year that the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was based in New York, launched a vast direct mail campaign. They printed hundreds of thousands of anti-slavery pamphlets, and they just mailed them around the country, sending them directly to the homes of prominent individuals all throughout the country, including in the South. Whether these were solicited mailings or not, in August, in response to the Anti-Slavery Society's press drive, 2,000 Charlestonians, South Carolina, organized into a group that they called, ominously, the Lynchmen, and they attacked the post office. They collected, they confiscated, and then they burned tens of thousands of pieces of mail that had been quarantined as abolitionist inspired. Now, if you know your 1830s history, and you may or you may not, you might remember that earlier in the 1830s, this is during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, South Carolina, a state too large to be its own nation, or too small to be its own nation and too large to be its own insane asylum, according to one South Carolinian on the verge of the Civil War. South Carolina had passed a law nullifying the collection of customs duties. This was the nullification crisis that prompted Andrew Jackson to contemplate a federal invasion of South Carolina to enforce federal law. Well, the post office is a federal institution, so you might think, well, 5 years later, Andrew Jackson, an advocate for federal authority, presidential power, at least as he wielded it, perhaps Andrew Jackson would feel like intervening here to keep the circulation of the mail going in South Carolina. But Andrew Jackson actually supported he tacitly offered his support. He didn't put his weight behind a bill that would have required postal officials to respect local law. So if South Carolina passed a law, or if Charleston City passed a law that prohibited the post office from circulating this kind of literature, he didn't support the idea that the federal government should just sort of let that happen. But he did support the regulatory violence of the Lynchmen against what he called monsters. Jackson described abolitionists as monsters who were, quote, attempting to stir up amongst the South the horrors of servile war, which is a 19th century euphemism for race war. The insurrectionaries, Jackson added, deserved, quote, to atone for this wicked attempt with their lives. So in Jackson's view, printing abolitionist literature was, in a sense, a capital offense. It needlessly provoked the white South. He also became an advocate for printing the names of local subscribers who sought out these publications. So this is, what you would call doxing in today's sort of culture. So Jackson supported making subscriber lists known so people could see who in their communities was reading The Liberator, or who might be reading David Walker's Appeal. That same month, October of 1835, violence against abolitionists racked the city of Washington itself. This was sparked by rumors that a local botanist and a physician named Reuben Crandall, who was a brother of the abolitionist Prudence Crandall. She had these were a white brother and sister, but they had, in Prudence Crandall's case, she had set up a school for, an integrated school in Connecticut, and basically got hounded out of the state for that, even in Connecticut, where abolitionists had more of a foothold. But in any case, the rumor was that Reuben Crandall was distributing abolitionist literature to local African Americans in the city of Washington. In the wake of Crandall's arrest for publishing what were called malicious and wicked libels, he was arrested for attempting to incite insurrection. There were a gang of 40 or 50 whites who began attacking free blacks. Somewhere I thought I had a slide of this, but apparently I don't. They went after schools and other black institutions, setting fire to homes in black neighborhoods close to the White House. And the mob even contemplated making a rush on the White House itself, because there was a White House servant named Augustus who had been rumored to also be distributing abolitionist literature. The attack on the White House didn't happen, but it was certainly up for consideration. You had other demonstrations of anti-abolitionist rage in Utica, New York. There was a riot there. But what happened in Charleston with the lynchmen, or in Washington, D.C., or even in Utica, was mild by comparison with what happened to Elijah Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist newspaper editor originally from Maine, but he had taken up residence in the city of St. Louis, which was a slave state at the time, and he began publishing a newspaper called The Observer. And among other things, Lovejoy wrote about lynching. He talked about cases of lynching that had taken place in St. Louis. There was one famous case that he wrote about. I'll make an allusion to it again in just a bit. But Lovejoy was attacked. His printing press was attacked several times. In St. Louis, he moved across the river to Alton, Illinois in 1836, and then he was murdered the following year in the fall of 1837 at a shootout in his warehouse, where he was waiting for his new printing press, the third that he would attempt to install. The previous two had been wrecked. And when his new printing press was being housed at a warehouse, local folk got wind of that and attacked it. Lovejoy retaliated and was shot to death as a result. For abolitionists, Lovejoy's murder was an act of martyrdom. It was an outrage. But it was hardly surprising. Again, people had been predicting this sort of thing. Slavery's most committed opponents had been arguing that the institution of slavery feasted on human flesh, that it could only be maintained through violence. And Lovejoy's martyrdom demonstrated that. It brought the violence inherent in slavery to the surface. And it carried an ominous sense of portent for the nation as a whole. Abraham Lincoln, who was an Illinois legislator at the time, who was serving his third term in the Illinois House, directly referenced Lovejoy's murder in a speech that became probably his most famous early address, which he delivered to the Young Men's Lyceum in early 1838, not too long after Lovejoy's murder. In that speech, he condemned what he called, quote, "the operation of this mobocratic spirit, which all must admit is now abroad in the land." He alluded to Lovejoy's death as well as to the lynching of Francis McIntosh, who was a free black boatman who had been executed in St. Louis earlier. This would have been 1836, I believe. Lincoln also pointed to a string of lynchings that had taken place in Mississippi, which was an unusual thing for a white person to call out in the 1830s. Lincoln gets dragged in various ways, justifiably and unjustifiably, for some of his views on race over the years, but it was highly unusual for someone who did not identify as an abolitionist to speak out about lynching. But in any case, he described the bodies in Mississippi dangling from trees in sufficient number to, quote, rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest. Lincoln condemned extra-legal violence against McIntosh, against these unnamed victims in Mississippi, against Elijah Lovejoy. He encouraged the nation as a whole, starting with his audience for the speech, to rededicate itself to the rule of law and to the judgments of courts rather than to what he called the wild and furious passions of the public mind. And he said, wherever the spirit, this mobocratic spirit, is produced, he says, whenever the vicious portion of the population shall be permitted to gather in bands of hundreds and thousands and burn churches, ravage and rob provision stores, throw printing presses into the rivers, shoot editors, and hang and burn obnoxious persons at pleasure and with impunity, whenever this happens, he says, the government cannot last. It would be not the last time that Lincoln would make that observation, that the country is at risk 3 decades in advance, 2 decades in advance. In fact, almost 20 years exactly between that and his House Divided speech. In any case, the violence of the 1830s, and we're just looking at a small subset here, set into motion some events that would flow almost uninterrupted for the next 3 decades. By the 1850s, Americans were murdering each other by the scores in Kansas. Southern whites were threatening to rupture the Union in spite of this very evident risk of sparking a civil war. Congressional leaders were thrashing each other on the floor of the Senate and assaulting one another in cabinet rooms, carrying loaded pistols on the floor of Congress. The crisis over the Fugitive Slave Act was provoking armed struggles in small towns in New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where abolitionists were attempting to prevent fugitive slaves from being recovered. As the poet William Cullen Bryant wrote in May of 1856, in the midst of all this, he wrote that, there's our friend Lincoln. I always get ahead of myself on these slides, but or get behind. But William Cullen Bryant described this as violence that had sort of infested the land. He said it lies in wait on all the navigable rivers of the Mississippi, or all the navigable rivers and all the railways of Missouri, to obstruct those who pass from free states into Kansas. This violence overhangs the frontier of that territory like a storm cloud charged with hail and lightning. In short, violence is the order of the day. Now, what drove this violence, of course, was a clash over material interests that were directly linked to the presence and expansion of slavery in the United States. Financial investments, land and commodities, access to raw materials like cotton and sugar. But it was also fueled by this mountain of printed words that had been produced over the last several decades, denouncing or defending the institution. And the violence was also fueled by an epistemological dispute over the truth value of those words. Were abolitionists lying when they described slavery as it is, to cite the title of one of the most famous collections of abolitionist documents written by or assembled by Theodore Weld and his wife Angelina Grimke? There's this wonderful pamphlet from 1838 called Slavery as It Is. And that set anti-abolitionists howling with rage. It's contained nothing but wall-to-wall lies, according to them. They're trafficking in fake news, in other words. And it's a short distance from the belief that your opponents are conspiring to circulate lies in print. It's a short distance from there to the conviction that your liberty and happiness depend on eradicating the source of those lies, and eradicating them with bloodshed, if need be. So that's the 1830s. And I'll just make a couple of observations here before I wind things up. There's obviously a lot of crucial differences between the anti-press violence in this period that I'm describing and today. For starters, the violence that I've described from the Jacksonian era was largely local in its focus. There were particular newspapers, particular editors, particular personalities who were targeted. There was a national component to a lot of this. I mean, people are arguing about issues that are increasingly national in scope, whether slavery ought to be extended into the territories, whether the federal government ought to take action to promote the interests of white farmers looking to move into new territories. So there were national issues at stake. Questions over the national bank and so forth provoked all kinds of partisan responses. But largely, it's these are the acts of violence are local in character. By contrast, the violence that we are at risk of seeing proliferate today is a lot more diffused and a lot more mobile. It doesn't have a sectional component to it. In other words, we can't, if we are, say, inhabiting the psychology of 19th century defenders of slavery, we can't point to a region of the country and say the abolitionists are coming from there, the fake news is coming from there. Or contrary-wise, if we are abolitionists, we can't point to a region of the South and imagine that all the sin and wickedness is concentrated below the Mason-Dixon line. So there's a lot more mobility. The Capitol Gazette attack in June of 2018 was largely driven by local grievances. Jared Ramos had a longstanding beef with the newspaper and its editors. But on the other hand, Cesar Sayoc's mail bombing campaign was the sort of thing that I think is sadly at risk of becoming more the contemporary norm. It's an extension of what we're familiar with in social media, which we describe mobs, Twitter mobs. I mean, this is now a thing that people study. All the different ways that you can talk about the new social media. If you're fans of what was originally a British series on Netflix called Black Mirror, there's an entire episode called Hated in the Nation. It's the last episode of season 3, I believe, that deals with the relationship between online outrage and an actual, terroristic violence taken out against reporters. So we've got no shortage of kind of anecdotes that we could draw on to kind of flesh this out. Specific reporters have been identified and have been targeted. When Donald Trump calls out Jim Acosta, when Donald Trump calls out Katie Tur of NBC, when Donald Trump called out Megyn Kelly when she was at Fox, you can see how these kinds of incitements actually produce results. When Trump's surrogates in the media, like Laura Ingraham describes, as she did last week, a 29-year-old freelance journalist named Talia Levin, who'd just been hired to teach one class at New York University in the summer, described Talia Levin as a journo-terrorist. Within hours, she had an avalanche of death threats in her inbox. There have been articles written about these kinds of things. And when asked about those kinds of threats at every point, Trump and others have basically said, it's not our fault. This is not our responsibility. Wolf Blitzer asked then candidate Trump in early 2016, I think even before he had come close to securing the nomination, like, is there anything you want to do to kind of tamp down the aggressive enthusiasm that your supporters have? And Trump said, I don't have a message for the fans, which is not true. He has a message. Sayoc was one of those fans. And although Cesar Sayoc had a criminal record that predated Trump's candidacy and predated the media environment that we live in, he became radicalized on Twitter in the same media environment that the president has used to stoke resentment against journalists. Here are a couple of graphs. This is from the Committee to Protect Journalists. This is the last point that I'll make here. And then I'll take some questions and we'll be done. The Committee to Protect Journalists has a database to track the president's use of social media to criticize journalists, specific news outlets, or the media in general. And as the CPJ has pointed out, Trump's rhetoric has been echoed not only in places like Cambodia and Philippines, where leaders have similarly railed against what they call fake news, but it's also resulted in specific reporters, some of whom I've already indicated, being targeted. Over time, we see that Trump's online denunciations of news have shifted. Over time, we see that Trump's denunciations of the media have tended to, here's a good graph, he's not been calling out specific individuals. Wait, this is the wrong one. Yeah, okay, here you go. So if you look on the left side of the bar, or left side of the chart, you see a lot more yellow. Those are tweets directed at particular individuals. Over time, the yellow bars get smaller, and the blue bars, which are denunciations of the media as a whole, get larger. So that's been the pattern. Trump has cast a wider net in his denunciations of the media. And here you see the specific rhetoric that he's used. Tweets about fake news represented here in red, obviously accelerate after the election. And we see a growing reliance on new phrases like enemy of the people, an opposition party, which is something that Trump has turned to really in the last 6 months, using that term opposition party, which he borrowed from Steve Bannon. But in any case, there's a lot to be concerned about here. Violence or the potential for violence against the press or the media is a cause for concern, not only because it threatens fundamental liberties like speech and conscience, but also because it undermines the role that journalists play in monitoring and holding to account those who wield power. So threats against the media obviously have to be understood as a species of political violence. There's a reason that the First Amendment is the first in the Bill of Rights and not tucked toward the back. There's a reason that Article 19 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights specifically uses First Amendment type language to acknowledge the right of everyone to freedom of opinion and expression. So these are political rights. This is political violence. And as we see in other countries, more autocratic countries like Russia, Thailand, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, journalists live in a constant state of danger. Now, it's a low bar to say that, well, at least in the United States yet, we're not seeing journalists being murdered on the, at the insistence of the head of state. But that's a pretty low bar. I think one of the lessons of the 19th century, though, is that, the U.S. has failed to clear the low bars before. A low bar in the 19th century is not wrecking your country with an immiserating 4-year civil war. That was a low bar that we failed to surpass. So I point to these kinds of things to argue that, it's not enough to say the U.S. is different. This can't happen here. There's a long record of Americans saying this awful thing can't happen here, and then this awful thing happens. It's part of this American exceptionalism, which is a form of denial, I think. But in any case, I'll end with that. This is not much of a crescendo there, but let's clear the low bars and then clear some higher bars, and then we can maybe not see as many of these bars. So, all right. Thank you.
5 minutes and 44 seconds for questions. Also, mic number 3, we good? Hello, hello, hello. It'll get there. Okay. Questions? You're closest.
Yeah, we don't have much time, so I'll only do my top 42 questions. One is just, thank you for a really excellent talk. And I think, as we move in the direction of a totalitarian state, which is where we're moving, just coming out of this talk, we'll see, and I'm glad you didn't use the apple pie metaphor for violence, because you left it for me. But I think all of us here, I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if the headline in the paper tomorrow was that 2 or 3 or a half a dozen important journalists were shot. And that's the situation we're in. And I'm not sure whether, you did talk about Elijah Lovejoy as being murdered. I'm not sure how much actual violence versus theoretical violence against the state against the press took place in earlier in our history. So that's kind of one piece of question. And then another is something that was extremely disturbing that I read from Chris Hedges, who is, I'm a fan of his. He seems to say it the way it is. And there is a movement kind of on the other side that looks at the main press sources as being completely compromised and essentially supporting the situation that got us Trump. So it isn't that you just kind of turn the clock back and no one's attacking the New York Times and the Washington Post and everything's hunky-dory. But there is a strong argument saying that the press has really failed its democratic duty from the other side. Mm-hmm. So maybe maybe you could comment on both of those points. Thank you.
Yeah, very real quickly. I mean, I think that the most ominous part of your comment was, you wouldn't be surprised to see, X, Y, and Z. We have seen this before. I mean, a lot of what's happening now reminds me of what would have been the precursors to what winds up with the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. I mean, you look at how deep the roots of that go, and there's a lot of, I think there's some shared terrain there. But yeah, I want to make sure we get the other questions though, so I'll try and come back to the second question that you had.
My understanding of the 19th century press was that it was pretty blatantly partisan. Nobody really hid. There's an abolitionist newspaper, there's a Republican newspaper, whatever it was. And it seems like then we kind of got away from that and people were, fair and balanced, or, we kind of thought CNN was sort of even-keeled, or, the paper of record and all that. And now what we're seeing is sort of calling out of this, whether it's right or wrong. And I'm wondering how you see that trend of the media over time.
Yeah. I mean, I love telling the stories about the partisan press in the 1790s when you had Thomas Jefferson sneaking funds from the State Department to pay his friend Philip Freneau to run, I can't remember if it was the Gazette of the United States or the United States Gazette. Anyway, Philip Freneau's publication was, basically masked as State Department, pro-Jeffersonian propaganda. And the same thing for Hamilton. Hamilton's in the Treasury Department, writing anonymous letters in his friends' newspapers about how awful Thomas Jefferson is. So there's a lot of beef in that early history, and the newspaper editors that I alluded to who were dueling. I mean, they were not just dueling over personal slights, but also dueling over political allegiances. So there is a long history of that, and certainly the rise of the objective model in journalism tracks with the rise of the goal of objectivity in, say, an academic discipline like history. Late 19th, early 20th century, there's this kind of confidence that a neutral standpoint is the best. I'm sort of agnostic on that question, but certainly we've seen over the last couple decades the repositioning or the realignment of media and the proliferation of openly partisan media, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It just means that there's a lot of, if you want confirmation of whatever bias you have, you can find it.
We better call it there for airtime. We have 30 seconds. Thank you all very much. We'll be back in 15.
That was Dr. David Noon discussing anti-media violence in American history and the perilous course ahead. His talk was recorded on Friday, March 29, 2019 at UAS in Juneau as part of the 2019 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council in partnership with the University of Alaska Southeast. With support from AEL&P, Coeur Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight and Associates, Sea Alaska, and Wastman and Associates.